Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Fifth Child podcast. I'm your podcaster for today, Chris, and I'd like to just say again, welcome back to the episode. This is our fourth episode, and we're still keeping this strong. So you might have noticed that something's a little strange going on with the channel. If you were following the channel previously, you would have noticed that pretty much every single episode up until this point, episodes 1, 2, and 3, had disappeared and is now currently found on this separate channel you're watching this video now on. Some interesting things happened with my Gmail account. I believe that my Gmail account got hacked. So in order to make sure that my security stays safe, I went ahead and moved everything else to a completely different Gmail. I completely deleted that first Gmail account. And so now we're kind of just going to have to start this channel up from scratch again. So definitely, like I said before, if you like this kind of content that you are seeing right now, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe. It is definitely important now because we're basically starting this channel all the way from the very beginning. And again, like I said before, if you want to see this channel grow even further, like I said, I have some plans in the description below on my Patreon, but if you want to, please go ahead and visit that Patreon account. And that way you can actually start donating every single month, whatever that you want to give every single month. That would help me be able to grow this channel further to what it more than what it actually is right now, and also give you a bigger variety of different content. I've got a lot of plans in mind. That I definitely want to create, and that's definitely the first major step towards creating that. No matter what, I'm still going to do this podcast unless something else happens. But regardless, with the amount of resources I have now, this podcast is the best I can do for now. I wish I could do more, but again, I need more time and, unfortunately, more resources to get something else off the ground. But like I said, if you really, really like what you see here, go ahead and like, comment, subscribe. Make sure to hit that ring, the little bell icon that tells you whenever every single episode pops up. And the current schedule for every single episode is going to be every Friday of the week at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. So with that, we're going to make this kind of another shorter episode again. Like I said, this is the weekly podcast where you will walk away with 2 different recommendations from either movie, video games, anime, television, or whatnot. And so for today, I actually have 2 different recommendations. I have one recommendation for a video game, and I've got one recommendation for a movie that I had just recently seen. You probably know what it is based on the thumbnail description. But let's go ahead and jump straight into the video game that I'm going to talk about today. So the video game that we're going to be talking about today is called Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. So a little bit of backstory on Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. If you remember me talking in Dead Cells, I brought up during the first episode when we were talking about Dead Cells, I brought up the genre of gameplay known as a Metroidvania. So a Metroidvania is usually a 2D explorative kind of action RPG. It can have RPG elements, it doesn't have to, where every single step you take in the game is kind of incremental, and if you reach a point or reach an area of the game that you cannot bypass, naturally you can always warp right around to another area, and you get an ability that allows you to bypass that and explore and open up the game even more. So the first true Metroidvania that was ever released was Castlevania Symphony of the Night by Konami. The Castlevania series was a pretty popular series for the Nintendo NES and Super Nintendo back in the day, but it was originally just a 2D side-scroller, kind of in the style of Ninja Gaiden. They were extremely difficult. There wasn't a lot of exploration in most of the games. In some games you had branching pathways, but it was kind of a linear path progression throughout it. The first game for the PlayStation 1, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, the first Castlevania game for the PS1, was developed by the current series producer, Koji Igarashi. And what Koji Igarashi decided to do was take influence from games like Super Metroid and the Metroid series in order to create a much more open-ended experience while also slapping in some action RPG elements into it. Castlevania Symphony of the Night still remains one of the most influential Metroidvanias of all time. It's probably one of the greatest video games of all time, and has since then been the influence for every single 2D Castlevania game released up until that point. There were 3 Game Boy Advance games, Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Harmony of Dissonance, Aria of Sorrow, and then there were 3 DS games, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, which was a sequel to Aria of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin, and Order of Ecclesia. However, Konami has caught a bit of a case of the dum-dums recently and has not released any substantial Castlevania game besides the God of War clones, Castlevania Lords of Shadow, in its respective sequels, and also making pachinko machines. So Igarashi ended up leaving the company in order to create his own developer called Artplay, which is the main developer of Bloodstained. Bloodstained has been a Kickstarted project since 2015 and has now been released on the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, Steam, and also the Nintendo Switch. Originally, it was being developed for the Wii U, but the game was already well enough into development. When the Switch came out, all resources were instead pushed towards making it for the Switch instead, because the Wii U was going to quickly fade into irrelevance. So there's the history of Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Ritual of the Night has a very, very high pedigree due to its main producer and the influence that it has that comes along with it. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is basically a spiritual successor to the series. It reached it's probably one of the most funded video games on. It's probably one of the more funded video games on Kickstarter. Kickstarter alone, and because of how well it kickstarted, a retro styled prequel called Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon, which followed a supporting character in Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, was developed by another little studio, Intercreates, who are well known for the Mega Man Zero games for the Game Boy Advance, which is not an actual Metroidvania. It's actually more in style of Castlevania 1 and Castlevania 3, The Curse of Dracula. I think it's called Curse of Dracula. So there's the backstory to Bloodstained. So let's go and jump right into the concept and the story. So the general story is about a conflict between... the story in Bloodstained takes place in the early 19th century, around the time that the Industrial Revolution is about to kick off. And there's conflict because of the Industrial Revolution that that sorcerers known as alchemists believe that they're going to become irrelevant. So in order to have more strength over the industrialists, they create these things called shards, which were infused crystals with demonic powers. Unfortunately, the shards went way out of hand, and this caused a whole slew of demons to kind of run around the land. And two of the characters that we're going to talk about, basically the two main characters, are Miriam and Jeeble. Both Miriam and Jeeble are best friends who were experimented on by the alchemists and have now become shard bringers, who now have the ability to utilize these shards for demonic purposes. There's also the downside of the fact that their bodies are slowly crystallizing, and then they will eventually die. After some of these experiments have occurred, Miriam has fallen into a coma, and Jeeble has also rallied the demonic powers, has used his demonic powers in order to rally demons and create this castle known as the demon, called the Hellhold. I think it's called the Hellhold. I can't very well call it Castlevania because this isn't a Castlevania series. But there's a demonic castle that Jeeble is now in control of, and after Miriam has awoken from her coma, her friend Johannes, who is an actual fledgling alchemist who works with Miriam, an exorcist known as Dominique of the church, who comes from the church, and a samurai from the Far East who hates demons known as Zangetsu, have decided to go into the castle itself that Jeeble is in control of and actually try to bring Jeeble back into the light, and hopefully stop all these demons from causing even more havoc. So that's the main story of the game. Honestly, there's not really much to the story besides that. No one really plays a Metroidvania for its actual story. They play it for the Metroidvania-style gameplay. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Like I said, the game is very, very much in the vein of a Metroid. It's very much a Metroidvania game. It's definitely a spiritual successor to Castlevania. There's different kinds of abilities that you can get throughout the game that allow you to branch out and open up different paths. If you've reached a path in the game that you have no idea how to get past it, you can then just go somewhere else, and eventually you will reach somewhere. You don't have your double jump ability. You can go you can't reach a high enough place. You can go explore somewhere else, and then you'll reach the different part of the game that allows you to fight a boss that gives you your double jump. There's different areas in the game that are inaccessible that will become accessible once you gain the abilities from the bosses that you have defeated. There's also a slew of different weapons you can use. You can use whips, you can use swords, you can use great swords, you can use guns, you can use hammers. There's a lot of different weapons you can use, which definitely reminds me very much of the Dark Souls series. So if there's a specific kind of weapon that you like the most, you can get good enough at that weapon. And the other thing that you can do is you can customize and craft different weapons as well. Throughout the game, you get different crafting materials from the enemies that you fight that allow you to go back to the start of the game where Johannes is, where his alchemist guild is, and then you can craft different weapons. So if you can craft different weapons, you can craft different armor that you get and that you can wear. And all of this is to help you get much, much better at the game. Like I said, with most Castlevanias, there's also an RPG element to it, so there is an experience system. You get a certain amount of experience every single time you kill some enemies. You'll level up. It raises different stats. It raises your health. It raises your magic. The best way to raise your health and magic, though, like the Metroid style of gameplay, like Metroid games where you could get energy tanks and missile tanks that increase your capacity, you can actually go to different areas in the game, have health upgrades, have magic upgrades, have capacity upgrades. Then as soon as you get that, it just gives you a rank up in every single one of them. So that's a lot. It's a lot easier to raise your health and HP your health and your magic, as long as you go out and try to find these jars of magic and health that raise your maximum health and magic. So earlier when I was talking about the shards have a really, really important influence on your gameplay. Throughout the game, as you beat different demons, if your luck is good enough, sometimes they will drop a shard. So in the game Bloodstained, you can equip different shards into Miriam, your main character. If I didn't mention this already, the main player character you play is Miriam. You can equip different shards. Different shards give you different kind of abilities. You can have a projectile shard, you can have a directional shard, you can have a passive shard, you can also have a familiar shard. A familiar is just a little demon or animal that helps follow you around and attacks the enemy for you. And there's a whole plethora of different shards that you can equip to every single one of those. And then you can also level those up as well. You can go back to see Johannes, you can use crafting abilities to level those up, and also if you attack the right amount of enemies the right amount of times, you can get multiple copies of that shard. And if you get up till 9, you basically have that shard 100% leveled up, and it does the most output of damage. And there's, like I said, there's a whole lot of different shards you can use that you can customize to the kind of gameplay you want. If you like a long range kind of attack, then there's definitely a shard combination for you. If you like to get up close and personal, there's definitely one for you. There's a lot of customization within the game itself. So that's pretty much it for the concept and the story that I'm going to talk about for now. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the style, to the graphics and the sound. Graphically, now, I'm going to base this on how the game looks on Steam. I haven't actually played the one on Steam. I played the Switch version. I got some words about the Switch version. I'll get to that in a little bit, though. Graphically, the game is not that demanding, but it uses its limited art style very, very well. It uses a 2.5 style of gameplay. The entire game is basically played in a 2D style plane, but the models all look like they are 3-dimensional, and it looks really, really good. Surprisingly, this is actually in the middle of Bloodstained's development. There was a gameplay trailer that released, and the graphics looked a little flat. And since then, Igarashi and Artplay have since updated and made the game look and run a lot smoother. On Steam, it runs at a solid 60 frames a second, and the environment, all the models look really, really strong. But probably the best thing about the game that I've seen from the Steam version is that all the environments look absolutely gorgeous. Excuse me. All the environments look absolutely gorgeous on the Steam version. In terms of the sound and music, the soundtrack is composed by longtime Konami composer and Castlevania composer Michiru Yamane. Yamane has done every single major soundtrack for the 2D Castlevania games since Symphony of the Night. And I gotta say, she does it again with this one. She has done probably one of her better soundtracks in the series. There are some tracks that are kind of hit and miss, but again, it uses that same kind of gothic rock, kind of prog-like style that the rest of the Castlevania series has done, and it works really, really well for this game. Alright, so here's the big iffy. I'm gonna put together the playability and the enjoyability of the game all into one category. So, I played the Switch version of this game. The Switch version is not very pretty. So my buddy has the Steam version of the game, and like I said, the Steam version looks and runs extremely well. You don't need the most highest demanding computer to play it, but if you have a great great computer, the game can look absolutely amazing, even with its limited art style. I cannot for the life of me think of a good reason why the Switch version runs as bad as it does. The game locks at a solid 30 frames a second. That is the cap of the frame rate, and I have seen points in the game when it dips into the lower teens. It sometimes can look okay. The game can run the range of looking okay to being absolutely god-awful. It's really, really bad. All the resolution has been dropped down. The environments look less vibrant in the Switch version. Not only that, but probably the worst indictment of the game I can find is the fact that it does not have enough response. It's not as responsive as all the other Castlevania games or the Steam version. There's at least a solid seconds worth of lag. It's very, very minute, but when you play it enough, you can definitely tell a difference that there is an input lag between the time you press a button to jump or attack and when Miriam actually makes that jump or attack. This makes playing the game extremely difficult. After I played a little bit of Bloodstain, I went ahead and picked up my Game Boy Advance SP and played Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, just to make sure if it wasn't just me. Maybe I had gotten worse in Metroidvania games. Nope, definitely not the case. Bloodstain has a definite input lag and makes the game so much more difficult than it actually is. Not only that, but there's one specific area in the game called the Tower of the Twin Dragons where if you get outside, there's a lot of platforming you have to do, and the frame rate drops down to probably about 12-ish, I would say. You compound that with the input lag, and it is unforgivably difficult, and it stops being fun. The other snag that I ran into is that when there's more and more projectiles on the screen and there's more enemies on the screen, and especially if there's more player characters on the screen, there's one boss fight in particular in the last hour of the game, the last half hour of the game, where there were so many projectiles going on, excuse me, that I had to level grind myself up, get myself a broadsword, and just spam my broadsword multiple times in the fight just because I wasn't fast enough to react. Oh, I was trying to be fast enough to react, but the game wouldn't let me react. So that's a big no-no for me. The game, it's Bloodstained itself, from what I've seen from the Steam version and how well the game runs when everything works fine on the Switch, it is an extremely good game that is very, very worthy of being a spiritual successor to the Castlevania series. But for the love of God, if you have the ability to play it on anything else besides the Switch, do not play this game on the Switch. I feel kind of duped that I pre-ordered it for the Switch, and all these problems just opened up like a can of worms. Luckily, from what we have heard, Artplay has released a statement saying that they are working on patching the game. We're going to get some small updates, I'm assuming, probably hopefully within the next month. Hopefully sooner. Because at this point, I have finished the game. I'm happy with finishing the game. I had fun for the most part with the game. But I cannot see myself doing any post-game content without there being significant patches. Because in order to do some of the post-game content, you've got to grind. In order to grind, you have to fight multiple enemies again. In order to fight multiple enemies again, you have to enter and re-enter an area. And whenever you enter a new area, there's a load time, and that load time can either be between 2 seconds to 10 seconds. It's really frustrating, and on the whole, I had more fun with the game than I was frustrated with it, because when the game actually got into a groove and I was really having fun with it, I really, really enjoyed it. But then the game got frustrating enough that I almost decided, you know what, I'm just going to trade in. Excuse me, I got a hiccup. The game got so frustrating that I almost considered just going up to my nearest GameStop or my nearest Mega Replay and just trading in the game for in-store credit, because there was many times when the game was really testing my love. And I really do not know why the Switch did not run this as well as it should have, because the Switch can run this sort of game. This was not a very, very high-demanding game whatsoever. If the Switch can run a slightly dumbed-down version of Doom and Wolfenstein 2 and still look amazing, there's no reason why this shouldn't have worked. So I kind of ended this segment with a little bit more negative than it really ended up being. Again, I do recommend Bloodstained. Just do not get it for the Switch, at least not yet. Wait until you hear word of mouth that these patches have actually helped out its case. The game's only $40 right now at retail, but there are sales going on right now for this until I think July the 9th, where you can pick up this game for I think like 34 or so bucks. It's supposed to be like 10% off or something like that. So, Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night. Do I recommend the game? Yes. Do I recommend you get it for the Switch? Hell no. Alright, and now we're going to go ahead and continue on to the movie I'm going to talk about today. The movie I'm actually surprisingly going to recommend you watch. You would not think that this movie will be very highly recommended, because if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it's sitting at a nice, pretty 22%, and it has a score of 42 on Metacritic. And the movie I'm talking about is Dark Phoenix, or X-Men Dark Phoenix, which is the last X-Men film in the X-Men franchise under 20th Century Fox, before the MCU, and Walt Disney finally decides to reboot the X-Men franchise in some manner. So X-Men Dark Phoenix is the 9th film in the X-Men franchise. It's the last one, and there's not much about the concept I can really talk about, because there are some slight spoilers that I do not want to talk about. But the big main thing, if you know anything about X-Men lore, you know that the X-Men are a group of young mutants who try to fight crime or try to help save humanity from some sort of threats. And the big threat that we have this time is the telekinetic X-Men Jean Grey. Jean Grey is a really, really powerful telepath who has now gained the ability known as the Phoenix Force, an alien life form, which basically makes her go crazy and makes her one of the strongest beings in the entire universe. So, I mean, and the entire story of X-Men Dark Phoenix is the X-Men attempting to save Jean Grey while also trying to fight this weird other alien force trying to coax Jean Grey the other way. Not much else I can talk about there. There's a lot of spoilers that the trailers don't go into that I certainly will not go into myself. So, that's the main story of Dark Phoenix. So let's kind of go into the legacy that Dark Phoenix and the X-Men franchise has. I, for the most part, really enjoy the X-Men franchise. It's kind of hit and miss. The X-Men franchise is very, very hit and miss. You've got some movies in the franchise that are not very good, and then you actually have some movies in the franchise that honestly are better than some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. The first X-Men movie, while it's a little dated till now, we can certainly credit the first X-Men movie for putting big blockbuster superhero and comic book movies to the forefront. If we didn't have X-Men, we might not have had Spider-Man, we may not have had Iron Man, and we may not have had Batman Begins, maybe. We may not have had the Avengers. So I can attribute to this mostly to X-Men, because besides that, the only big major superhero movies that came out before X-Men were the Superman series that came out in the 70s and got really bad in the third and fourth one. the Batman series, which started out with 2 solid Tim Burton movies, and then one really not good Joel Schumacher movie, and 1 awful movie, Batman and Robin, and Blade, which no one really saw. So the X-Men franchise is definitely a very pivotal moment. The release of X-Men 1 was a pivotal moment for superhero comic book movies. So I definitely give it a lot of credit. X-Men 2, on the other hand, is such a huge step up from the first movie that it's almost in a completely other world. I've recently rewatched all the X-Men movies, and I forgot exactly how much I loved X-Men 2. And then that lost all of its goodwill when X-Men The Last Stand came out, and X-Men The Last Stand was originally the first X-Men movie in the series that tried to tackle the Dark Phoenix Saga storyline from the Chris Claremont and Jack Kirby, right? No, not Jack Kirby. Chris Claremont and the John Byrne storyline from the late 70s and early 80s. It did not do well, and therefore kind of killed the X-Men franchise for a little bit. And then there was the X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was the solo Wolverine movie that followed Hugh Jackman as our favorite claw-wielding adamantium skeleton mutant. And that one was super not good. It's laughably bad. And then the series found new light with X-Men First Class, which reintroduced us to younger versions of most of the main cast. To some of the main cast, we got to see a young Professor X and a young Magneto, played by James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender, and First Class was just absolutely amazing. It's one of my personal favorites. And then Days of Future Past, which I'm just going to go ahead and say full spoilers for Days of Future Past. Days of Future Past melded together the best of the old X-Men movies and the best of First Class, and pretty much put the whole reset button on the entire thing. The X-Men Days of Future Past basically made it so Last Stand did not exist, or X-Men Origins for that matter, and pretty much paved the way for a brand new timeline for X-Men films. Not only that, but we got 2 great spin-off movies with Deadpool and Deadpool 2, which are hilariously funny, and we've also gotten Logan, which is the solo Wolverine movie that just released in 2017 and is quite possibly one of the best superhero films of all time, and is up there with The Dark Knight, Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame for me for best superhero movie of all time. Excuse me. I had a little bit of a hiccup. Excuse me. I had some hiccups there for a second. I think they're gone? Okay, I think they're gone. So the last X-Men movie in the franchise that had these characters in them specifically was X-Men Apocalypse. X-Men Apocalypse reintroduced younger versions of Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, and Nightcrawler. And it wasn't very good. It was kind of the X-Men Apocalypse was directed by Bryan Singer, who had previously directed X-Men 1, 2, Days of Future Past, so 3 of the best X-Men movies, and he came back on to direct X-Men Apocalypse. And the film made some really, really weird choices in terms of how it framed its story. It was kind of... The entire story of X-Men Apocalypse is basically how the first mutant apocalypse came back into present day and wanted to pretty much exterminate all life. So there was certainly some heady end-of-the-world stuff going on in it, but there was such a big clashing of tones with the series that I really, really... It's not that I didn't like it, but I recognized that it was very, very uneven and it wasn't really great. I definitely enjoyed it because it was certainly some good old-fashioned superhero schlock, and I definitely enjoyed it on that level. And just from the series alone, and the performances were good enough. You go into an X-Men movie like this, no matter what, all the performances for the most part are going to be great. There's way too many great actors in this movie that they couldn't give their all in. And so that pushes us into Dark Phoenix. So Dark Phoenix was the direct sequel to X-Men Apocalypse. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the cast and characters a little bit and how they're portrayed. And Jean Grey is portrayed by Sophie Turner, who is also Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones. Sophie Turner didn't give the greatest performance in X-Men Apocalypse, and that's partially just because she was not nearly as experienced back then as she is now. I want to say the last few or so seasons of Game of Thrones have really done a great job of testing her acting ability, and she has since improved since then, and she is one of the best things about Dark Phoenix. There's definitely a conflict that you can sense within Jean Grey herself, and Sophie Turner does a really, really good job at portraying that. Some of the decisions she makes that are influenced by other forces kind of don't make that much sense. But all in all, I don't fault Sophie Turner at all, because I think she did a great job with what she was given. I also give a lot of praise, again, to James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender as Charles Xavier and Eric Lehnsherr, Professor X and Magneto. Both Professor X and Magneto have always had the most interesting history between the two in all of the X-Men franchise. You can, just from watching the first 3 X-Men trilogy, you can tell that there is certainly you can definitely tell that there was a friendship between them, and there definitely was a falling out. Professor X had the hope that mutants and humans could eventually live together in harmony, while Magneto believed that humans will always hate the mutants no matter what, so the mutants must rise up in order to defeat them. So that history was definitely very obvious in X-Men 1, 2, and 3, and ever since First Class and Days of Future Past, Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy have such great chemistry together, and they work so well in their standalone scenes, and they work even better when both of them are on screen. So it's always a joy to see them. They do some interesting things with both of their characters that I can't really go too much into. I'm not going to go into too much of a spoiler with Magneto, but I will say his reasoning for sticking his head out into this conflict is a very, very good reason. I definitely liked it. Even though the specific catalyst caused some other things I don't really agree with, I was A-okay with Magneto's decisions. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. So I'm glad that I think this was a very good way to bring Magneto into the fold, and I definitely think he was much better used in this movie than he was in X-Men Apocalypse. One of the weird things about James McAvoy's Professor X's character that I don't really agree with the way they took his character, was in how they kind of portray him as being kind of vain. So, like I said, Professor X believes that humans and mutants can work together in harmony, and one of the main ways he tries to get to that is by having the X-Men at this point being Cyclops, Mystique, Storm, Beast, and Nightcrawler, and Jean Grey, and Quicksilver. The way that they try to go about this is basically acting as an extra arm of, say, the U.S. military, the U.S. government, to take care of different crises. And so the X-Men eventually get a lot of praise for all that they do. But Professor X kind of gets called out on this multiple times. Whenever the team gets put in danger, like, for example, in the beginning of the film, the X-Men tried to save some people in a space shuttle that's getting ready to explode. And while they definitely succeed in their mission, this is when Jean Grey gets hit by the Phoenix Force and then gains the powers that she has throughout the film. Mystique calls out Professor X on this and says that asking him if this is just a vanity thing for him, which is very, very weird, because this is not an aspect of Professor X's character that we have seen in any of the films. I'm not sure if we've seen it in the comic books that much, but I definitely don't agree with that sort of character assessment. But besides that, there's definitely one sequence in the movie between Professor X and Nicholas Holt's Beast, where both of them are definitely on the top of their performance games, and I can't go into too much spoilers, but it's definitely one of the most viscerally acted sequences I've seen in the X-Men films, and almost feels like it was ripped out of the Logan playbook of acting. It was extremely thought-provoking and very visceral, and I definitely enjoyed that aspect of the movie. If anything, throughout the entire movie, when the actors are allowed to give their characters great performances, they all shine extremely well. So that goes on to some of the negatives with some of the characters in cast. Jessica Chastain plays the secondary villain, known as Vuk. Can't go into too much spoilers with her, but she's basically someone who's trying to steer Jean Grey one way or the other, trying to use her power to harness the Phoenix Force. And Jessica Chastain's the best actress in this whole movie, and she's underused. She kind of came off as the worst actress. So her entire character and her group of people she's with could have easily been cut out of the movie, and it would have made much of a difference. So her character definitely takes a precedence in the mid-act of the movie, which was probably the worst part of it. So wasn't a big fan of that. Pretty much every single other character in this movie was underused. We don't see a lot of Storm. We don't see much of Cyclops. Cyclops and Jean Grey have their relationship, and you don't really get to see them do much with it, unfortunately. Beast has some interesting things. Beast goes an interesting way with his character that I definitely do enjoy. I definitely liked it. It did seem kind of... It did seem like it kind of came a little out of left field, given the catalyst that caused it, it made sense to me. Evan Peters as Quicksilver was completely underused, very surprisingly, because in both X-Men Days of Future Past and Apocalypse, both of his sequences were probably two of the best sequences in both of those movies. Spoiler alert, there's no sequence that has that kind of level of awesomeness. There's no Time in a Bottle musical sequence. There's no Sweet Dreams Are Made of This sequence again, like in X-Men Apocalypse. There's none of that in Dark Phoenix. And that kind of goes into my bigger problem with the movie, is that the tone of the movie is a little bleak. It's not quite like the Fantastic Four reboot, where it just seemed dark and dingy all the time and kind of humorless. The movie itself just kind of comes off as a little bland. There's not really any specific style to it. You can definitely tell that there is a style going on with Fantastic Four. The question of whether or not that style was correct is an academic matter entirely, but Dark Phoenix itself doesn't exactly have its own specific style with which it's trying to go for. With the Bryan Singer movies, you can certainly tell there's a style there. With First Class, you can definitely tell director Matthew Vaughn was doing a very, very, very pulpy kind of style there. With Dark Phoenix, it doesn't really have that much of a style to it. It just... If there was a baseline bland X-Men movie in the same vein as like the bland MCU kind of film, Dark Phoenix would probably be that kind of best baseline for it. Altogether, yeah, the tone is probably the biggest issue. It could have used with a little bit more lightening up, and it could have used a little bit more of a stylistic approach. The film itself was directed by Simon Kinberg, who was also the main writer, and who's also been the writer of pretty much every single X-Men movie since X-Men The Last Stand. He's hit or miss. Sometimes his scripts are really good. Sometimes his scripts are really not so good. It's sometimes... The problem with the X-Men films, it's kind of hard to attribute exactly who is at fault with the things that are wrong with it. With X-Men Apocalypse, it's hard to tell if the screenplay was incorrect or if Bryan Singer's direction was just not that great that time around. It's really hard to tell. So for Simon Kinberg's first official directorial debut, he didn't do a bad job, but this is certainly a big budget X-Men film. Is definitely not the best first choice I would make for a first-time director, even with someone who has as much of a pretty decent screenwriting pedigree as Kinberg does. Other things I could talk about, the music is amazing, very surprisingly. I'm a little upset that John Ottman did not return. John Ottman's score for X-Men 2, Days of Future Past and Apocalypse are definitely iconic, and the X-Men 2 suite is 100% the main theme of the X-Men franchise. I was glad to hear it come back in Days of Future Past and X-Men Apocalypse. So there really isn't a general theme like that, but Hans Zimmer does do a really, really good job with the music. Hans Zimmer's the main composer of the Dark Knight trilogy and all the Nolan movies, and the sound of it certainly sounds like a Nolan film. Um, if they really wanted to try to get this to sound like a Nolan film, they should have just gotten Christopher Nolan to direct it if they wanted some kind of style to go with it. But altogether, yeah, the music did look really good. The music did sound really good. In terms of the CG and and how the film looked, the cinematography again looks kind of bland. Like I said, it kind of has a dark, kind of dingy, just kind of normal, bland kind of feeling to it. There are some really decent shots in it, but surprisingly, the CG is not as bad as I thought it was going to be. I thought because of how rushed that this film was, I thought that it was going to have really, really, really rushed computer-generated effects, and it actually did not look that terribly bad. One of the last sequences in the movie is a fight on a train, which is probably actually one of the coolest action sequences in the X-Men franchise. I'll just say that as a whole. The whole first act of the movie I thought was pretty okay. I thought it was fine. The second act of the movie was where it kind of dipped below in quality. And then the third act of the movie is actually, excuse me, I got more hiccups again. And the third act of the movie is where I definitely saw it kind of raise in quality considerably. The third act of the movie with that final fight sequence on the train actually did bring it up quite a bit more in quality for me, so I definitely did enjoy it. So, altogether, I'm going to give X-Men Dark Phoenix a very, very good... I'm going to give it a recommendation with a bit of asterisks. Kind of go in with low expectations with this one. I particularly did go in with a low expectation. Throughout the entire promotional sequence for Dark Phoenix, I was joking with my friends and my girlfriend the entire time. I do not care about this movie. It doesn't need to exist. I can't even believe it's actually coming out. This should have come out like a year and a half ago. Why is it coming out now of all times? So all the lack of promotions for it up until the last 4 or so months before it was going to come out, definitely didn't sell me on the movie. So I thought that this movie was going to be absolutely awful, but then the movie came out, and honestly, I wouldn't say it was pretty good. I would say it's fine. There could definitely be some people who definitely enjoy it. If you are a huge X-Men fan like I am, there's definitely some enjoyment in it. This wasn't a film that had anything specifically really wrong with it, but it didn't exactly have a lot of things going on with it that made it spectacular or really great, like all the other great X-Men movies. In terms of if it's a better film than some of the other X-Men movies, it's 100% a better film than X-Men The Last Stand and X-Men Origins. It's probably better than X-Men Apocalypse. I might have enjoyed X-Men Apocalypse a little bit more, but I think this was definitely the better film. It was definitely more coherently made. This was a much smaller scale kind of movie, and in that kind of case, it did work. So I'm gonna give a slight recommendation, X-Men Dark Phoenix. I definitely wanted to talk about it, get my thoughts out there. It was a film I mostly enjoyed. If I had the choice to watch it again, I definitely think I would, and I think I might like it a little bit more the second time too. It's definitely a brisk movie. Out of all the X-Men films, it's probably one of the shortest. It's less than 2 hours long. And there's not a lot of stuff going on in it, so it's a very, very well-paced story, I would say. So I think, if you're an X-Men fan, I think you would enjoy it. So with that, that's it for the podcast. So that's your 2 recommendations for today were Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Make sure to get the PS4 Steam version, not the Switch version, and X-Men Dark Phoenix. Go in with lower expectations like I did, and you will come out probably enjoying it. So with that, that's it for the Fifth Child podcast. I'm your podcaster, Chris, and I want to say thank you so much again for coming by. If you like this video and you definitely want to see more, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure to hit that bell icon if you're using this on Android or iPhone, so it lets you know when the new episodes drop every Friday at 12 o'clock. And with that, I will hopefully see you on the next episode. I already got a good idea of what anime I'm going to be talking about. I definitely know what video game I will be talking about. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you guys, and have a great rest of your day.